Tonight on Nation to Nation, election headache in Manitoba. 2 votes in 3 days to determine the Chief and Council of the Roseau River First Nation. We speak to investigative reporter Melissa Ridgen about it.
This settled nothing at Roseau, unfortunately. It's just a bunch of the same sides warring again.
Getting rid of the Indian Act could be a start. But what would it take to fix problems in how band councils are elected and how they govern? Policy analyst Rachel Ann Snow has a solution.
We want to see a change. If we actually want to stop the assimilation or termination policies of the federal government, we're actually going to have to do some hard work in our communities.
And Niki Ashton wants to lead the federal NDP and one day be Prime Minister. Why should Indigenous people support her bid?
One is growing inequality, the other is climate change, and on both of these fronts, Indigenous communities are front and center.
Welcome to Nation. Hello, I'm Todd Lamoran. We start tonight with what is being called an outrageous assault on the public's right to know. Justin Brake is the reporter-editor of The Independent. Last October, he was covering an occupation in Labrador. A group of mostly Indigenous people were protesting the development of the Muskrat Falls hydroelectric project. Brake was charged with civil contempt. He argued as a journalist covering the event, he shouldn't have been charged. Justice George Murphy disagreed. Brake faces 2 criminal charges that carry a maximum sentence of 10 years. He joins us via Skype. Mr. Brake, how is Justice Murphy's decision an attack on journalistic freedom?
This decision is actually not the final decision in these charges. This was sort of an aside. We argued that the injunction that named me, along with land protectors who were protesting the project, should be thrown out because the corporation running the project didn't inform the Supreme Court of Newfoundland and Labrador when it applied for the injunction that I was a working journalist. The judge ruled that they didn't have to, but that's not the final decision. That's not a final ruling on the case. I haven't been charged. I haven't been convicted of anything yet.
I suppose if even the fact you haven't been convicted and you've just been charged, how does this affect how journalists cover civil protests, especially Indigenous ones?
Well, the charges in the first place, 1 civil contempt charge and 2 criminal charges, are an attack on press freedom, because if journalists fear that they are going to feel the heavy hand of the law when they're in fact doing a major public service by bringing a major national story of great public interest to the public, they shouldn't have to fear legal consequences for doing that. And because I actually did it, we got to see how important that story was, and how important it was that there be a journalist there to cover it.
I suppose with the advent of social media, live streaming on Facebook, how important is it that journalists continue to show up at these events?
Oh, it's incredibly important. I mean, there are, as we know, it seems that there are a greater number of Indigenous-led resistances to things that threaten the well-being of everyone, not just that pose a threat to Indigenous people, but threats to water, whether it's pipelines or whether it's large-scale hydro dams, threats to water, Indigenous lands, natural resources that we depend on for life and for sustenance. And so it's Indigenous people that are on the front lines a lot of the time of these battles, trying to protect the resources for everybody. And if there are these spaces where journalists can't go, where these frontline battles are happening, then that should be a concern for everybody in Canada.
Okay, Justin, thank you for doing this for us.
Thank you.
Up next is the election controversy in the Roseau River First Nation. Roseau is less than an hour's drive south of Winnipeg. It held an election a week ago, but a federal court judge declared it void, and a new one was held 3 days later. 2 people who had won a seat on council were declared ineligible to run the second time around. Council hopefuls wanted to get Roseau out from under a controversial deal with the Red Sun gas bar, located on an urban reserve just outside of Winnipeg. APTN investigates reporter Melissa Ridgen showed that status numbers were being used by non-status customers for tax-free gas and cigarettes, and that non-banned businessman David Dewar profits from a deal signed by previous chief and council. To put things into perspective is investigative reporter Melissa Ridgen. Welcome, Melissa.
Hi, Todd.
2 elections in 3 days. How did it come to this?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I should clarify that Roseau River has a custom election code. So in 1991, they established a code that sets them out of the parameters of the Indian Act in terms of how their elections are held. So they have an election every 2 years. This year, things looked like things were going to go ahead as per usual. Custom Council, which is a group of 21 family members, get together. Band Council gets together, and they decide to agree on the election rules. What are the terms of this election? When will it be held? Who will be the electoral officer? That sort of thing. So they do that, I believe, in January. They set out some guidelines and rules that both sides can agree with. Custom Council's representative agrees. Band Council's agrees. Then right before the election, the outgoing chief, Alfred Hayden, who wasn't seeking re-election, goes to court to ask a judge to not to stop the election, but to change the electoral officer. There's a couple of concerns saying that some of the things that they had decided would be the election rules hadn't been being followed. They didn't they alleged that the electoral officer wasn't properly vetting candidates, and that candidates in this election were not allowed to run if they had criminal records. Roseau had decided, and they were arguing that she wasn't making sure that these people were off the list. So some people with criminal records were allowed to run. So that was one of the problems. Another problem had something to do with they weren't going to have advanced polling at a Winnipeg polling location. And Custom Council went ahead and organized that and held advanced votes in Winnipeg, contrary to signing a deal that said they wouldn't do that. So a federal court judge is asked to put the pin on this, send in a new electoral officer. They send in a new electoral officer, but the community runs this person out of town and says, no, we're sticking with the electoral office that we have, and we're doing our vote as we planned, essentially. So that happens on Thursday. The results come out. Alfred Hayden, the outgoing chief, is back in court the next day with the band lawyer to have that result deemed null and void, and to have another vote on Sunday, this time with the electoral officer that the court had appointed and under police presence. So voters had to go back and start all over again on Sunday, and there was a different result as a result of the second vote. The chief remained the same, Craig Alexander. He won on both Thursday and on, Thursday, the Custom Council election, and then Sunday, the court-appointed election. Craig Alexander won both times, but council shifted shapes a little bit. And in between that, 3 of the people who had run on Thursday had been deemed ineligible to run on Sunday, 2 of whom who had actually won council seats. So they were no longer able to run, certainly obviously didn't win seats the second time out. So the council took a different shape on Sunday.
How much did the Red Sun issue play a part in this double election?
Well, it was a big talker leading up to the election. There was, I'm on a lot of Facebook friends with people from Roseau River. I'm on a lot of Roseau River Facebook pages. It's certainly a talker when APTN Investigates revealed what that deal is that their community has with Red Sun, and separate from that, what type of goings-on we found at Red Sun with a hidden camera investigation. So it was a talker, and a lot of people were like, "This, we need to re-examine this this deal that we have with Red Sun. It's not going to happen under previous leadership, but maybe this is the chance with a new council to reopen that deal, re-examine that deal." And a lot of people feel that it's not a fair shake for their community, and they want to see that remedied. So I would assume that would be how they chose who to vote for.
So, Melissa, what happens next in this story?
Well, my phone and email and Facebook blow up with messages of this settled nothing at Roseau, unfortunately. It's just a bunch of the same sides warring again. It's going to be challenged. One argument is, well, how can this Sunday election be valid when we have our own custom election code? So the federal government, a federal court, has no jurisdiction over our elections. But I think the problem with that would be, but your band went to court to ask them to intervene. So they were invited to intervene in your election. They didn't just come storming in. You asked them to via Alfred Hayden. So there's going to be challenges, I'm sure, saying that the Custom Council election was the one that's valid. No, the Sunday one ordered by the court is the one that's valid. There's probably 50 shades of gray in between there. If you know anything about Roseau's history, it's a community that is in court against itself forever, constantly. So I would expect that'll continue.
Okay, thank you, Melissa, for this. After the break, Indigenous policy analyst Rachel Ann Snow weighs in on how First Nations governance has to free itself from colonial influence. Welcome back. Before the break, we heard about some election issues the Roseau River First Nation in Manitoba is facing. So how widespread are the problems with band elections? Most of them happen without a hitch. But we've heard many complaints over the years, not only when it comes to band elections, but about the fairness of Indigenous governance. Joining me now via Skype is Rachel Ann Snow. She's a member of the Stoney Nakoda Nation in Alberta. She's a policy analyst who has spoken at length about Indigenous governance. Ms. Snow, thanks for joining me.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lamoran, for having me on the program today.
Now, what is the #1 problem preventing true democracy from happening on First Nations?
I think before we talk about democracy or when we're speaking of Indigenous governance, we have to remember that every First Nation or the original people who exist here in Canada have their own ways of dealing with governance. They also have a specific way that they conducted themselves prior to colonization. So when we talk about what the North American definition of democracy is, I think that's applicable if you're in a municipality or a federal or a provincial election, because you don't know your people or you don't know your neighbors necessarily in urban settings or in non-First Nation settings. But on reserve, we are together based on clans, based on kinship. So we know the people we're running against. And sometimes what I've always said is that there is no true democracy on reserve because the demographics don't change. The big families who can vote in the people year after year are sort of in control of what's happening on reserve. And that's not a system that is or was our sustainable governance system.
Now, the situation with Roseau River, I know they've blamed a lot of it, a lot of the problems they've had on adherence to the Indian Act. Even though they do have a custom council, they still run elections according to the schedule of the Indian Act. Would getting rid of the Indian Act help things?
Well, I don't think there's anybody who's not going to say that getting rid of the Indian Act wouldn't help Indigenous people. But behind the Indian Act is the federal government and the policies. So that is, even if you outlawed or got rid of or the Indian Act was struck down, there are policies coming up right now, the Education Act, supposedly something on child family services. And again, so these areas of governance that we always had the jurisdiction for are now sort of being compartmentalized, shifted over a number of ministries. So I don't think that approach is going to help, because the problem is also coming from larger direction, policy direction.
You talked earlier about clans, how a lot of First Nations, that's how they're divided. When it comes to governance and band elections, what is at the bottom of the divisions that seem to plague some communities and make governance difficult? And how can you overcome that?
Well, I think when we talk about governance, and again, I'm reiterating that it cannot be a one-size cookie-cutter, everyone is fit under the same governance systems. If there were pre-settler original people communities that had voting, then continue with the voting, or sort of the custom, or whatever they're calling it under Indian Affairs. Continue with that type of choosing for your leadership. But primarily, what our governance systems included was a measure of spirituality. we follow the laws or the laws of creation. So our governance systems are not only for us, the people, they extend to the land, to the waters, to the plants, to the animals. So when you think about that, I don't think that governance system is the same as mainstream's governance system. So we have a responsibility for stewarding and for working, sharing, and working communally with each other. That's been taken away with this sort of top-down hierarchy. And I think that's part of the problem, and we need to correct that. And the only way we can correct that is within our own communities, going back to the original ways we had of working together, reaching consensus, establishing our own laws and jurisdictions. What did we do when a child needed to be parented by somebody else? What were the ways that we taught skills or education to our children? Those types of things that we've always had, that have always sustained us, we can't have that dictated to us. We can't have that put into a policy, and we certainly can't have our leaders or representatives right now going along with this model, because in the last Canada 150 years, it's proved ineffective. It's increased our incarceration. It has not dealt with our poverty. So for all of these reasons, if we want to see a change, if we actually want to stop the assimilation or termination policies of the federal government, we're actually going to have to do some hard work in our communities.
Now, I know you can't speak for everyone, but how would you move to a more, for a lack of a better word, democratic system of governance in your own community?
Well, I actually made this statement that I would like to. My late father was a longtime chief, Reverend Dr. Chief John Snow. But when he came back to his community, it was the elders who approached him and asked him to run. And they knew that there was a process in place. But what they thought was that what they had hoped was that, we'd go through the Indian Affairs sort of election process. But it was, in fact, the elders who had chosen him to run and to serve his people. So keeping with that and the changes that have happened, I too would like to run for that position, but I would like to also restore or step down as the Headman Indian Act chief and try to restore the kinship ways, the clan system, so that we'd have a number of people working together, the heads of households speaking together, working together in the community for the very concerns, for the traumas, for the addictions, for the many things that are hurting our communities, the housing, the water. We need to come together as a people and sit down like we used to sit down, bring out ideas, bring out consensus, and restore the ceremonial, traditional things, the things in our languages, all those things that make us who we are. And that's how we regain the pride and step up to the plate and become the sovereign nations that we've always been in this land.
Well, it sounds like it's a tall order to do, but I'm sure it's something to be striving for. Thanks again for joining us, Ms. Snow.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you very much for having me.
Coming up after the break, we ask NDP leadership candidate Niki Ashton why Indigenous people should be supporting her. Welcome back. In studio, we have Niki Ashton, who recently announced her bid to be leader of the NDP. She currently represents the riding of Churchill-Kiwatanug-Aski in northern Manitoba. Ashton was first elected in 2008 when she defeated actress Tina Keeper. This is her second run at the leadership, as she lost to Thomas Mulcair in 2012. Ms. Ashton, welcome to the show.
Great to be here.
Now, you represent a riding with a lot of Cree communities, of course. How would your leadership of the NDP benefit them and all Indigenous people?
Well, I'm actually tremendously honored to represent a constituency with Cree, Dene, OG Cree, and Anishinaabe communities, and especially after the last election where the boundaries were shifted. And for me, I have to say, much of my inspiration in my political work is very much rooted in the Indigenous communities I've had the honor of working with. I'm constantly inspired by the resilience of First Nations and Métis communities in our riding, of young people, of elders, of leaders who against so many barriers are challenging, I would say, colonial policies and also colonial mindsets. And for me, the work that we've been able to do in northern Manitoba, the work that we've been doing side by side and in solidarity, is very much the kind of work that I'd like to do as part of this leadership race, and also, moving forward as leader. For me, all politics is local. It's rooted in the grassroots. It has to be rooted in community. And as I've pointed out, there are two key issues that our campaign has identified that we need to tackle as a progressive party, as the NDP. One is growing inequality. The other is climate change.
Now, of course, one of your opponents is Charlie Angus. He's been strong on the Indigenous file as well, especially education. I guess for Indigenous people, what makes you a better candidate then?
Yeah, I mean, I'm thrilled to be running in a race with so many colleagues that I respect a great deal, and they're colleagues that I've had a chance to work with for many years, and certainly it's well known that many NDP MPs have done incredible work on Indigenous issues, including my colleague Charlie Angus. And I think that this race is going to be an important opportunity for us to strengthen the messages that the Liberal government is dropping the ball when it comes to Indigenous issues.
Now, something you've brought up in the House many times over the past couple of years is murdered and missing Indigenous women. It's been described that the MMIW inquiry has gotten off to a bit of a rocky start. How confident are you about where this is going?
Well, we've expressed concern from the beginning about the mandate that the inquiry was given. Obviously, the fact that give attention to the police is not something that's a key part of the inquiry. That's wrong. We know that the police have been a contributing factor in some cases. And according to the Human Rights Watch report, have actually waged violence on Indigenous women, and it's simply not acceptable that the government saw that shouldn't be a serious part of this inquiry. We are concerned about the fact that, as we've heard recently, that many families are feeling left out. Communication is key. And the other thing we said, I mean, we've certainly wished the Commission all the best in the work that they're doing. And really what we're saying is that the government has to has to make the investments necessary so that we can deal with the factors that in many cases render Indigenous women put Indigenous women in difficult situations. And that means investing in housing, investing in education, investing in women's shelters and programming. And while we've seen some piecemeal investments on some of these issues, things like housing and education, we haven't seen real change, and that's simply not okay. And we're going to continue to push the government on all of these fronts.
Okay, well, that's it. We're all out of time. I want to thank you again, Ms. Ashton, for coming in and doing this, and best of luck going forward.
Thank you so much, Todd, and I look forward to being out across the country and visiting with many Indigenous peoples about this campaign.
Okay, that's all the time we have for this week's edition of Nation to Nation. Jorge Barrera will be back next week. I'm Todd Lamarand. Have a great evening.